Hello and welcome to Mrs. Long's video lesson on the poem Felix Randal. This poem is written by Gerard Manley Hopkins. And just to give you a clue as to the content of the poem before we look at the poet, you'll see some images here of farrier, or what you might think was at first as a blacksmith, but this man specifically makes shoes for horses and fits them. And that's the occupation of the man referred to in the title, Felix Randal. Now, Hopkins was a Jesuit priest, and if you're familiar with any of his work, you'll know that he often has religion as a key theme in his works. Also writes a lot about the beauty of nature and the natural world. And usually, if you remember in class, I tell you don't assume the speaker in the poem is the poet. But this is one of those poems where actually most people who analyze this poem interpret it as Hopkins speaking from personal experience, because the speaker in the poem is a priest, he is a priest, and there is even a suggestion that the man in the poem, Felix Randal, is based on a young man that he knew in real life. So what the poem is about is it's basically looking at the illness and the passing on of this farrier, Felix Randal. Okay. And what it does was it takes us through a description of Felix in his dying days and how the speaker is reacting to the news of his death. But then it goes from definitely goes from a more objective point of view to so exploring the spiritual connection that is formed between these two men during the counseling process. So let's have a look at the poem. And at first it is quite a tricky one when you read it. A lot of people the first time they read it feel a little bit intimidated, but you'll see once we look at the analysis that it's actually not all that inaccessible as it seems at first. Felix Randal, the farrier. Oh, is he dead then? My duty all ended, who have watched his mould of man, big-boned and hardy handsome, pining, till time, when reason rambled in it, and some fatal for disorders fleshed there, all contended. Sickness broke him. Impatient he cursed at first, but mended, being anointed and all, though a heavenlier heart began some months earlier, since I had our sweet reprieve and ransom tendered to him. Ah well, God rest him all road ever he offended. This seeing the sick endears them to us. Us too it endears. My tongue had taught thee comfort. Touch had quenched thy tears that touched my heart, child. Poor Felix Randal. How far then full thought of, all thy more boisterous years, when thou at the random grim forged, powerful amidst peers, didst fettle for the great grey dray horse his bright and battering sandal. Excuse me. So, as I said, it does, the cadence, the syntax of the way it's written does tend to make it a little bit intimidating at first. But before we even go and look at each stanza in turn, and we look at the imagery that gets used to try and unpack the ideas a little more clearly, I wonder if you can perhaps spend a few moments looking at the structure of this poem. And if you count the number of lines in this poem, it should give you a clue. Have you got it yet? Yes, it's a sonnet. It's got 14 lines. And if we look more carefully at the poem, we'll see that it is actually an Italian or a Petrarchan sonnet. And you'll remember from previous lessons on sonnets that a Petrarchan sonnet has a very recognizable rhyme scheme, particularly in the octave, which is the ABBA or ABBA ABBA, as I like to say. And then the sestet can have a selection of different rhymes CDE, CDE, or CDE, CDEF, but this one is CCD, CCD, so very rhythmic. And as you will know from previous sonnet studies, is that the choice of writing a poem in a sonnet is usually not an arbitrary one. And if we're looking specifically at an Italian sonnet, we're looking at the difference in content and tone, usually between the octave, the first 8 lines, and then the last 6 lines of sestet. And this is very true of this poem as well. So in the first 8 lines, what Manley Hopkins is doing is he's establishing the situation leading up to Felix Randal's death. And then the sestet is an exploration on a more emotional level. So he recollects the facts of Felix's illness, then he laments his personal loss, and we end the poem with this lovely image of Felix in his prime of life, in his youth, before he became sick, which is quite lovely, because I think most of us would admit that if somebody passes away, you don't want to remember them if they were sick or they got elderly. You don't really want to remember them in the more frailer times, but perhaps in the happier times when they were stronger and more boisterous, which is a lovely word that gets used in this poem. Okay, so if you look at, as I said, Petrarchan sonnets usually has a very different tone between the octave and the sestet, and here you'll see that there's a definitely more matter-of-fact tone in the octave. The feeling that, you know, a priest who ministers to the sick would, I suppose, as most healthcare professionals or people who work with those who are sick and dying, have a little bit more of a removed attitude towards the people they counsel and spend time with, because you cannot, for the state of your own mental health and spiritual well-being, let yourself get too close to people who are dying, otherwise it will take a great toll on you. However, in the sestet we see that the speaker is in fact quite sad and heartbroken by the death of this man who he spent time tending to and getting close to. You'll see on this slide we've also got some information about the fatal 4 disorders, which had a lot to do with how people understood the body and the different humors of the body, and how they thought that the kind of substances that existed or overproduced or didn't produce in your body could have an impact on your personality. So there's some interesting information about that. Okay, let's look at our first stanza, or our first 4 lines of the octave. So here we've got the priest's initial reaction to Felix's death. Oh, is he dead then? Very matter of fact, not much emotion there, and even the reference to my duty. In other words, if something's your duty, it's not always that you're choosing to do it, but it's something you feel like you should do. It's part of your job. It's part of your vocation. It's not necessarily something that you would choose to do. So we've got this slightly more removed idea of Felix Randal, the Pharaoh who's passed away. But what we do get an idea of is the kind of tragedy from an objective point of view of this young man who was a mold of man. In other words, he kind of was this archetypal, like you would base people off him because he's so beautifully put together, and obviously somebody who works with horses and is able to bash metal out on a forge, and then grapple with horses, which are very large, strong creatures. He'd have to be quite burly and strong. And so you've got this lovely alliteration here: big boned and hardy, handsome. Strong sounds as well: big boned, hardy, handsome, which kind of helps us envision the strongness of this man. Then you've got the words, the repetition: pining, pining. Now, pining is something you do when you're suffering or when you're sad. Okay, so you can imagine the kind of emotional distress that a man like Felix Randal would go through if he was experiencing his physical decline. And here we've even got his mental decline with when reason rambled, sense of confusion. So you've got this image of a man who had a lot of physical strength and potential, but he was robbed of that by his illness, which is confirmed to us at the beginning of the next line. Sickness broke him. Now, this could be a physical or a spiritual brokenness. You can imagine physically you would be broken down by the symptoms of your illness or your disease, and people who are facing their death also struggle, I think, often to find some sort of spiritual meaning in that, because if you're a person of faith, while you may not be afraid to die, you also don't want to die, because life is to be lived, and he's still young, and he's possibly got a lot that he wants to do. So you can see here the frustration that Felix Randal must have felt. He was impatient. He cursed at first. In other words, so his reaction to his sickness was anger. And you've got some lovely assonance there to highlight that idea of his initial reaction to his death. But then you've got some lovely religious imagery, and we hear here what the job of the priest was. So the priest would have anointed him with oil or holy water, perhaps, prayed with him, spent time talking to him about the matters of life and death. And so he mended. In other words, he didn't become physically mended, but spiritually he would have gained, as the poem says, a heavenlier heart. Okay. And the heavenlier heart, in other words, a heart focused more on the afterlife than the life on earth. Okay. And then it said, began some months earlier, since our sweet reprieve and ransom. So there is what the priest and God had given him. So initially we see that Felix Randal would have been very frustrated, perhaps as he spent more time with the priest, would have then come to a place of acceptance of his physical condition, and then moved his focus onto his spiritual health. Now, the last line of the octave, we still have quite an objective response from the priest, which is, well. In other words, things happen, and then this very sort of impersonal blessing. God rest him all road ever he offended. Kind of like the platitude that you would say, I wish may his dear soul rest in peace, that kind of thing when somebody passes away, but not a very personal or specific response at this stage. That, however, is going to change as we read into the sestet, which will be part of the next video on this poem. Before I go, let's have a look again at the alliteration used here, heavenlier heart, reprieve, and ransom, which serves more than, I think, a function of sound, is more to link these ideas, heavenly heart and reprieve and ransom, those ideas that all have to do with the idea of the sort of peace that you can come to in terms of finding comfort in something bigger than yourself, in your spirituality, in a godlike figure who can give you a sense of purpose and meaning, even though your physical body is declining and your physical life on earth is coming to an end.